Hello, today we're going to have a discussion about information security and data privacy in the higher education sector. I'm Tanya Sewell. I'm an executive consultant at Equantiis. I've worked on various cyber or information security projects over the past few years, as well as some GDPR data privacy projects with various sectors.
Hi everyone, I'm Janine Chasma. I'm a managing consultant with Equantiis. We're an independent business consultancy that help organisations go through transformation and change. And I primarily work with our higher education sector clients to look at ways to become more operationally efficient and improve student experience. And with operational efficiency also comes information security. So as Tanya said, we're going to be chatting through some of the unique challenges in the higher education sector, and then some of the practical things that you can do to put into place ways to be more secure and aware. So Tanya, I think the first thing we wanted to say, right, was this just happens to other people, right? It's not something we need to worry about.
Yeah, and that's a common theme, isn't it? And that's not just higher education, is it? That's across many of the sectors we work with. I think a lot of organisations think, why would I be a target? It's not going to happen. It's not going to happen to us. But the reality is actually that anyone can be a target. It's not like hackers or incidents or people looking to target and attack are necessarily going for a particular organisation or even type of organisation. It really does depend. I would say universities possibly more at risk for specific targeting because of some of their activities, particularly on the research and development side. But I think we just wanted to point out that actually there have been incidents in the past that have affected universities. The Blackboard hack affected universities and other sectors. And there was a survey done by central government that found that 54% of British universities had suffered a data breach in the past year. And quite a large number of that tends to be phishing attacks and impersonation, that sort of thing. And with that comes a need to have a really strong people defense. Technology can get you so far, but that people element is really important. And kind of looking at those stats again that came from some of these surveys, 46% of the institutions interviewed also indicated that they hadn't given or received any information security or data privacy awareness training in the past year. So it's useful to highlight those things.
That just struck me as you were saying that there, actually, Tanya. I'm just thinking back to places I've worked. I think, you tend to have a lot of information given to you at the beginning when you start an organisation as part of an induction, but actually that regular training and awareness, ongoing kind of refreshers, or just to highlight, changes in either legislation or the sector. The advent of new technology means you do need to refresh and keep that knowledge up to date, even if it is an area that you're kind of working in. So I'm not surprised by that stat, but I am really shocked about the 54% of universities, over half of all UK universities suffering a breach in 2020. Really is a shocking stat.
Yeah, and I think that there was generally seen to be an increase in attacks across all sectors as a result of COVID as well. I think where I guess hackers saw an opportunity where actually they knew that a lot of organisations were maybe letting the guard down a little bit. They suddenly had to switch very quickly to have people working from home in a different environment, and a lot of organisations maybe didn't have the the infrastructure in place to support that. So it was kind of an easy target. And also, obviously, a lot of organisations were quite distracted with other things at the time. So I think that's probably why there was an increase in attacks as a result of COVID. And then I think the university sector in particular, there was seen to be an increase in attacks, particularly on some of them, because of the research and development functions around COVID vaccinations. And that led to an increase in attacks on that sector as well.
Tanya, I think if we think about this particular sector and some of the unique challenges it faces, do you think that the expectation in this area has got worse since COVID in terms of the budgets required in order to be, following good practice around security.
Yeah, I think that is an issue, and again, it's not limited to the higher education sector, but obviously this particular sector has been through so many changes over the last few years. With the move to fee-paying students and things like that, there's different levels of expectations, and budgets are tight. And I think the spend historically maybe hasn't been adequate to then deal with the sudden need to change because of COVID, where suddenly you've got to cater for online learning for students without necessarily having the full infrastructure to be able to do that. So it's sort of led to this need to deliver, but sometimes without an adequate budget to have been able to make sure that the right infrastructure and with appropriate information security was in place from the outset to support that. So I think there's this kind of trajectory at the moment where the expectations are quite high in terms of what universities need to provide and what teams need to deliver, where the budget has been quite low in the past.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. I think if we think about some of the clients we've been working with at the start of 2020, lots of projects, including like big transformation projects, were essentially put on hold because it was a case of going into lockdown for that first time, which was so strange and unprecedented for everybody in all businesses.
Yeah.
For universities, it wasn't just, we've got to send staff home. It was now we've got to teach our students remotely. And so for straight away, you've got different types of people accessing, secure information in a completely different way. Even those institutes that might have done remote or distance learning, this was en masse very quickly. So any planned kind of training or security or any other projects, we just found that they were all put on hold during that period. And then I think if you fast forward to catch up with where we are today, we're sort of probably out of that initial panic stages if we've got to do this, to really finding our feet about how to continue to maintain a hybrid way of working, a hybrid way of teaching and learning. So I don't think everybody's got it sewn up yet. I think institutes don't probably have a very clear indication of exactly what things are going to continue to look like.
Yeah, it's really hard, isn't it? Because it's continuously evolving at the moment. And I think kind of like you, some of the universities that I've worked with over the last year, they've had to move not just the teaching side of it online, but a lot of them, parts of the enrollment process was still required somebody to physically, or enabled somebody to physically go into a university to do something, fill in a form, pick up a card, do whatever, and that suddenly wasn't there anymore. So they've had to sort of jump to put these new processes in place, and often they have been reasonably clunky, I guess, from the user experience side, and particularly I know for some that that piece around information security and identity management and things like that have been quite a challenge.
Yeah, as you were talking there, it struck me. I was just thinking, just for enrolment, all of the different types of secure personal information, visa information, and then you've got information being captured, special category data like ethnicity, gender, sexual orientation, health information. There's a lot of special category data. You've got images, photographic images being taken for students as well. So the challenges were already there, and then you lock people down and make them access data in a completely different way, and it just escalates that picture very, very quickly.
Yeah, and I think the HE sector is quite unique in that sense, that the variety in data and the sensitivity of some of it is quite unique. And you've got the impact of the General Data Protection Regulations, GDPR, with some of the things that you talked about there, Janine, with the ethnicity and health data and things like that in particular, and any accessibility requirements a student might have. And as well as visa information, copies of passports, things like that. And then, with the research development type data, I mean, some of that is obviously funded by corporates and the public sector as well, potentially, and some of it is ripe for kind of nation state type attacks as well. You know, some countries would be very keen to get their hands on some of that, and you know, we saw that with the rise in attacks during the COVID vaccine development. So yeah, it's a really unique sector, and I think I don't know about you, but I think one of the things that I find really interesting about the higher education sector is the culture. I think from what I've seen, and again, this can have quite serious ramifications for data privacy and for information security, is that cultural piece, because the institutions that I've worked with have tended to be fairly siloed. It's you know, and individual departments have their own processes and their own ways of doing things. There's there's often a kind of slow adoption to some extent, particularly, you know, think about academics in terms of being quite slow to adopt new technology and things like that. And then you've got, you know, these processes which span many different functions across the university, like enrolment is a prime example. There's touch points all over the place, but typically I think the different departments or functions don't necessarily understand the full process or really ever see it. And I think there's massive risk there in making sure that information is kept safe. I don't know if you've got any examples of that, Janine.
Yeah, I totally agree. I was just thinking as well, you know, if you add in, you know, separate schools as well as another example of how, you know, that kind of the siloed ways of working. I've been working with a client last year, and we found something like 50 separate CRMs across one institute. So if you think about all those, you know, data instances, and they had, you know, several different schools all working as a kind of microcosm of the institute themselves. And then, yeah, within those functions, you've got, you know, the legacy technology, which is a challenge. We know that. The separateness of those tools and systems as well, the lack of integration. And then you've got, you know, the added, you know, additions of, you know, working with academics who perhaps are sometimes slower to adopt those changes than our staff members as well. And then, you know, if you add in the peaks and troughs of the academic year, you know, different admissions periods, different, you know, you might have people doing short courses or, you know, different types of courses where they've got different intakes, clearing if that's something that universities relying on, maybe bringing in temps for those peak periods, and you know, you add other people in like academics and temps just as a start, Tanya, and all of a sudden that just increases your training burden, right?
Yeah, and this is it, isn't it? Because if you're suddenly bringing in temps who haven't worked in your institution before for what a month period maybe, have you given them appropriate information security training and data privacy training? I don't know, perhaps, but it does add something else to the mix. And there's that particular piece that you just mentioned, Janine, around clearing. You know, you have this massive peak in workload suddenly, and availability then becomes absolutely key, doesn't it, at that point, which is obviously something that when you're looking at you know, information security, it is a massive consideration, something that they really need to think about.
Absolutely. Tanya, I know the organisations we work with, when we're doing kind of a broader sort of health check with them, we look at, you know, a number of different, I guess we call them dimensions, in terms of areas to look at and compare, you know, sort of current maturity. But I know we wanted to pick out a few today and just bring them to life with some more sort of examples from the higher education sector.
Yeah, so I think actually I would say that the HE sector is unique in many ways, again, compared to some of our other sectors, because they do tend to have quite good governance structures in place already, and obviously and policies actually, and I think they've kind of had to become good at that type of thing, partly because of things like freedom of information that they've had to deal with in the past. So maybe that puts them a step ahead than some other sectors, perhaps. I think the issue, though, is it's not just about having those policies and procedures and governance structures in place. It's are they actually working, and have those policies and procedures actually been embedded into operational practice. And I think when you think back to what we just spoke about, that the fact that in our experience a lot of universities work in quite a siloed way, I think that becomes quite difficult, because you've potentially got different interpretation of those policies in different areas, and that can obviously cause a problem. And I think the other thing that can be a problem, and again this has come up in some of the surveys that have been done in the past, that there's still some buy-in issues there, I think, and it's really important for information security that buy-in is at the highest level of the organisation, because if the people at the top aren't doing it right, then the people below that aren't going to see that it's a priority. I don't know what your experience is, Janine, in that sector, in terms of how well embedded do you think those policies and procedures and things are?
I mean, I know a colleague of ours would say, good policy should be well thumbed, right? There's no point having a very well written, perfect policy that then, goes in a folder on a shelf or locked away in squirreled away in a corner of SharePoint and nobody ever looks at it. So you're absolutely right. It does need to be set from the top and embedded all the way down. And it has to be something that people champion at kind of grassroots level. There's got to be, whether you call them champions. One of my clients the other day called them data heroes, which I loved. I imagine them wearing capes. There needs to be, real practical help, support, advice, solutions. I mean, often, our marketing colleagues, the marketing department, or the parts of the institute who are looking at attracting, new students, are quite good at this. They know, they've worked their way around GDPR now for a while. They understand things like consent and obtaining the right information. So there often are a good army of people who would be great candidates to have as champions. But whether or not, as you say, Tanya, that the structure and the setup is there and in place, and what happens when people leave? Do those champions get replaced, or does that data protection officer get replaced and trained? I'm not so convinced about that.
Yeah, ditto really. So then we move on to assets. So again, I would say that again, universities or higher education institutions have had a bit of a head start on this, because freedom of information came in 20 odd years ago. I don't even want to think how long ago it was actually now, but that came in a long time ago, and it forced a certain level of governance, a certain level of document and records management, and it made institutions think about what their assets were, so that they could apply appropriate controls over those assets, so they could retrieve them if needed. But whether those, it's the same really as with the governance piece, whether those like records of assets and records of processing activity as well for GDPR, whether those things have been maintained, I don't know. I don't have the answer to that, but it's obviously really important that those things are maintained over time and kept up to date. I don't know what your experience is of that sector in relation to that piece.
I think like with any of these types of projects, there's always good intentions at the beginning, and I'm sure they exist in many of the institutes we know and work with. It's the keeping them up to date that I would think there's probably some work to do.
And I think particularly in relation to the GDPR piece, the processing activity, because obviously that's a legal obligation to keep and maintain that. And with that siloed environment and the rapid change that's been experienced since COVID, I wonder how many organisations have been doing those data protection impact assessments and have been updating their the record of processing activity.
Yeah, in fact, you've just prompted me to think about the next one. I know we're talking a lot about security here, but in terms of privacy and subject access requests, when a subject access request is made, we've got institute will have the 1 month to respond unless they can successfully prove that it would be more onerous for them to get access to that data. But I was just thinking what a nightmare it would be if you're an institute, to reply to a subject access request when you're that institute that's got 57 CRMs and schools that do things autonomously, and this disconnected data and these systems not talking to each other, and old access databases that I still found one last week with a client. So yeah, that's potentially a troublesome area too. But I think, and I know you're really passionate about culture and awareness, Tanya. Do for you, is it the area where in all sectors there's the most opportunity to gain?
I think yes, and I think when we look at the work that we do with various organisations around looking at their information security maturity, and looking at how we can help elevate that does tend to be an area that scores fairly low across the board, and I think it does come back to that point around, even if there are some policies and processes in place, they often have been produced by somebody in a very abstract way and then kind of just shoved on an internet site that haven't necessarily really been absorbed and engaged with by people within the organisation. And again, it comes back to that point that we talked about at the beginning, that it needs to come from the top. People at the top need to be saying how important information security is and data privacy is for it to really start being taken on board. And it's that piece around making sure that there's a big investment, or an adequate investment. It's got to be reasonable, hasn't it, to the circumstances, but an adequate investment in training and things like that. And I think there's also a piece around what's the incentive. There is the potential to use sort of incentives to get people on board to applying and embedding these policies and procedures. And there's also sometimes we work with the customers we work with, we do some social engineering testing, and this is actually really useful in this area, because I think often people think that they're better than they are, and I think we often find the situation where actually whichever function is responsible for data privacy or information security, they think everything's dandy and wonderful because they've written a policy. But actually, when it comes to it, and when you do some social engineering, you find that people aren't actually really applying even basic information security awareness. So sometimes we go in and we'll try to physically get into a building or a room that we're not meant to be able to get access to. Sometimes we'll do some SMS or some email phishing campaigns, those types of things, to see how far we can get. And pretty much always it's possible to breach those people defences, and actually it's a great way of exposing and kind of shocking and awing people higher up that actually it's a big problem and that they need to make that investment in that area. But yeah, for me, culture and awareness is key. And I'm sure I know it's the same for you, Janine.
Yeah, I'm just thinking, I'm just going to flash up on screen here actually some kind of key terms you just mentioned, phishing there, Tanya, and I think it is, it's back to that original question, so this doesn't happen to us, right? It happens to other people. We already heard at the beginning that 54% of universities have been breached. Over half of UK universities, this is already an issue for. So if it's not on your radar, it could well be.
Yeah.
And I know, spear phishing was found to be the easiest way for hackers to get in to higher education institutes, and for a small percentage of universities, it's money stolen, it's personal stats, it's actual attacks.
Yeah.
Data being destroyed or altered or taken away. So I think when we're talking about culture and awareness, we are talking about what policies have you got, what happens, what do you do, but there's probably a piece of work to be done here about just understanding what some of these terms mean, and just having a bit of personal responsibility and accountability for some of this stuff too, and also to think about your institute's data in the same way that you think about your own bank account details or national insurance number or passport number.
Yeah, I love that, because actually that's what I always say to clients, actually, in relation to GDPR in particular, It's that think it through in terms of what would you expect if it were your data. And, you know, like you just said, it's the same. We should be applying the same level of protection to the organisation we work for's data as we do to our own.
Yeah, it's that concept of treat your student like your customer, you know.
Yeah, but you're absolutely right. I think with the spear phish and things like that, and other types of hacking, it's that that basic understanding of what the red flags are, and the sniff test. Does it, you know, that sniff test, does it look right, or are there things that aren't quite right in there? And it's giving your employees and volunteers or whoever else you have working for you that ability to be able to run through that test before they click on that link in an email, for example, or send off a payment from the bank account.
Absolutely. Tanya, on the next one, third party management, you already mentioned that Blackboard example. You know, there were 20 plus UK universities caught up in that ransomware, that blackmail attack. How important are third parties to higher education institutes?
Well, this is the thing, isn't it? Because actually we're all dependent, aren't we, these days, in reality, on third parties. I mean, you know, cloud computing sort of came from nowhere really and took over, and there aren't many organisations left with on-premise, like entirely on-premise. There's always something in the cloud, and actually universities are typically making use of many different software providers, cloud service providers. There's people who are printing out their student ID cards for them and things like that. You've got that piece for international students, the use of agencies, which adds a massive complexity, particularly because some of those tend to be in high risk areas.
As in location-wise, Tanya, you mean countries that are high risk?
Countries, yeah, high risk countries, yeah, but processing quite high risk data, special category data as well. And then there's relationships with corporates and central government as well, for various different sets of information around research and development. And then you've got a connection with UCAS and various other organisations. So yeah, they're just inherently ingrained, aren't they? And it's absolutely key. The thing with the Blackboard thing is there are a lot of organisations caught up in that. We don't know the complete details of that yet, and whether there's going to be any kind of investigation or anything. But I think as long as you've done your due diligence carefully, then it affords a level of protection to your organisation. So not just in potentially making sure that you prevent or mitigate risks around third parties in the first place, but you're never going to be able to, in reality, mitigate all risks. There are always going to be some out there. Attacks get more and more sophisticated all the time. But making sure that you've done a basic level, at least, of due diligence checks around what that third party's information security and data privacy posture is going to, one, reduce your risk, and two, reduce your risk of a fine, I guess, from the Information Commissioner's Office if it affects personal data.
I think the key point takeaway here really is, you know, as the data controller, you've still got liability, right? So even though you might have a third party processing something on your behalf, you know, if the ICO come knocking, it's the institute that's still responsible for any, you know, potential issues.
Exactly. Yeah. It's difficult. It's a difficult area, I think, actually, for all sectors, to be honest, because there are a lot of risks.
Yeah, absolutely.
And like you said, you're the controller, so you take responsibility. So doing those checks is really, really key. So data management practice. What are your thoughts on this, Janine?
I mean, it's a constantly evolving area, and you know, you've already mentioned, you know, freedom of information. Tanya has forced a good level of, you know, data management practices, like, you know, people understanding more now about retention policies, and actually just I guess really, you know, just the avenue you mentioned, moving into the cloud, you know, moving away from you know, paper files, actually, I think has helped people to question, you know, it's like, oh, we're just keeping this for a rainy day in case we need it, you know, and if you don't have those files, these physical files anymore, it does make people think, well, actually, do I need this? What do I need it for? How long do I need it? What am I going to do with it? I think some of the processes behind it are still quite manual, and there is still, some added risks with kind of, internal and external systems and working out where, how you're going to manage data, where it's going to be, that kind of thing, who's going to get access to it. And I'm sort of continually coming back in my mind to this picture I've got in my head of these disparate siloed data instances, with duplication, not just of data but of effort as well, in different locations. How accurate is some of this data? How can institutes actually be practicing, the key GDPR principle of data minimization? It's a minefield. It's an area that I think institutes really should. I mean, look, everything on this slide here is important, right? But I think to make some quick wins here would be a good area, practical area to put some time and effort into pretty quickly.
Yeah, I'd agree with that actually. That, and I think, and some just on the culture and awareness piece, just basic training. Those two things coupled together, and obviously one enables the other, really, doesn't it, as well?
For sure. I think we'd probably like to take digital and network security probably together. We're talking here about things like network systems, apps, identity management, data and information sort of security. Any thoughts on this area?
It's an interesting one, isn't it? Because actually, in the report that we've already mentioned, that was commissioned by central government, the conclusion was that universities manage their information security like a big corporate, which would suggest that actually those technical controls are fairly robust. And even though universities were targeted more during the COVID vaccine development, none was successful as far as we're aware. So perhaps that's a positive sign in this area. I would say, from what I've seen in universities, there has been investment in network security and things like that. I think sometimes there's quite a lot of bureaucracy in universities that can be slow speed to sort of respond in terms of applying security patches and things like that. Perhaps that needs to be a little bit quicker in some places. I have witnessed the odd situation where, in trying to make a better customer experience as a result of the COVID period, where everything's suddenly gone online, information security rules have been relaxed, maybe a little bit too much, particularly given that personal data is obviously involved because it's a university. So again, I guess that comes back to maybe that speed thing. And change governance, which I know we're coming on to a little bit in a minute.
Absolutely. And I mean, we've mentioned it already, but the impact of home working surely would have had a bearing here as well. But interestingly, even earlier today, I was talking to a client, and just general staff were sort of saying things to me like, "Oh, well, no, we've got two-factor authentication now, and yes, we all know that we can't, just work out of a hotel for the day and use the public Wi-Fi." So, I think levels of awareness are there and improving, which is great to see. And I'd love to think that there was a championing of this from our IT colleagues in higher education, and they were helping to push that through. Interesting. I mean, I know one of your favourite topics is physical security. You've already mentioned some of the fantastic work that we've done in terms of trying to do some social engineering exercises to get access. But again, with home working, has that meant that actually physical security is not an issue anymore?
Depends on the sector, actually. I mean, so obviously, it really does depend on the sector, because some have obviously moved very, very clearly to pretty much all home working. So then it's a different kettle of fish, isn't it? It's how secure is your laptop, really, and your personal device, because actually they're going nowhere near a business premises or anything like that. If there's something physical being produced, and I guess again, some of our clients who have research and development functions, that's a good example. And typically, actually, they're having to physically go in, and there is something physical which could be stolen or accessed in some way. So I don't think, you know, and those, those server rooms and things are still running if they are running on-prem software. So I don't think it's gone away. It's just slightly different. And I guess the threat is just in a slightly different place. But yeah, it's really important. Just I think often, particularly where a lot of places, and we use it as well sometimes, we use the term cyber security, which kind of makes everything sound like it's about digital security to me, whereas it's not really. It's about your data and your assets, isn't it? And some of those will be physical, you know, and some of your intellectual property and a university is probably tied up in a test tube or something, for example. So yeah, it's an area that I think sometimes gets neglected, and often we do test that, as I already mentioned, on our social engineering exercises. It's always good fun, and it's often an area which is actually slightly weak, because I think there's this assumption that everything's digital now, so it's all safe and secure. But you know, even thinking about things like clear desk policies and you know, making sure that whiteboards in R&D labs are white or not visible from anywhere else. Just basic things like that are quite important considerations as well.
I mean, I guess with less staff on site, there are less people to challenge any sort of suspicious activity as well. And
yeah,
you know, we're not just talking about, you know, the odd office, are we? You know, we're thinking here about multi-site campuses, accommodation, or, you know, halls of residence, or IT centres and hubs, libraries. You know, there are a number of different types of physical buildings that, you know, potential hackers could be trying to access.
Yeah, and I think one of the challenges that some of our clients have found is, you know, before there would be that recognition of somebody, but actually, with the shift to remote working, you don't necessarily recognise Joe, who just joined the finance department. So actually, anything, you know, anybody can pretend to be Joe.
Yeah, absolutely.
You know, you haven't got that recognition anymore, that came from sort of repeat visits. So that presents a bit of a challenge, doesn't it? So change management. Should we move on to change management?
Yeah, let's do it.
I love change management, and again, I love it because it's just an area, isn't it, that that I think often falls over. I think universities are possibly slightly different in that there are usually governance structures around major change, but I think the thing that slips through the net sometimes as smaller changes, and they could be a change of third party, maybe. A change in a process. We've seen this happen quite a lot. There's and again, because of the siloed nature of universities, there's a change in a process at one part of, I don't know, the enrolment process, for example, to help students have a better experience, or to help process payments more quickly, or something like that. And actually, it ends up impacting on something else, another process within that journey. And in some cases impacts on information security or data privacy. So it's really important to get a really good balance here, I think, between not being so overly controlled that actually you can't even update a really important security patch quickly, because that absolutely needs to just happen, versus, you know, needing to take a little bit of time just to validate that a change makes sense, not just in terms of information security and data privacy, but also for the whole process.
Yeah, I think that's a brilliant point. I was just recalling a university I worked with at the very beginning of lockdown, who, you know, did some great strides to change their enrolment process and to try and make as much of it, you know, online, digital as possible. But they still needed to do some in-person registration in order to hand out a physical student card. So what they did was they got a load of student volunteers to help them with this. But of course, in their hand, you know, they've got a barcode, they've got a student number, they've got the picture, the ID of somebody. So, you know, a huge, you know, risk there. You've got, you know, that you're placing on temporary helpers, in this case not even paid workers, volunteers, and yeah, pretty sure that they didn't, you know, do any data protection impact assessments or anything like that to, you know, to show that they had you know, quite a significant change in business process. So yeah, you know, even where with the best will and all the good intentions are there. It's just having that moment to step back and think, what are the potential risks and impacts of this change?
Yeah, and like you said, it's from that do I even need to do a data protection impact assessment? That let's not just change it really quickly because we need to do something here. Let's just take a moment. Is it going to impact on personal data? Do we need to do a data protection impact assessment? And just taking those steps and having a little bit of control and oversight over it, and just engaging with other people in downstream and upstream in the process, just to make sure it's not going to cause anything unexpected to them or to their data is really important. And actually it's just good practice, isn't it? It's good data management practice, really, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. I think that sort of nicely brings us on to the last one as well, in terms of event and incident management. I know you're quite a fan of sort of mocking incidents, Tanya. Kind of say, we do fire alarm testing. Why not do data privacy testing as well?
Yeah, absolutely. But this is the thing, isn't it? It comes back again to, these policies and procedures and things. They should be living, breathing documents and entities. And I think the one of the key things in all of this is testing, really. And it's not called out here separately because it's an inherent part of, I guess, your culture, I suppose. But if you just come up with a process and you don't test it, how do you know it's going to work when you need it to work? And I think event and incident management is particularly incident management is one of those things. It takes time and a lot of effort to mock it, but actually it's really important to make sure that everybody understands what they need to do if an incident does occur. To make sure that the procedures you've put in place and those plans actually work in a real life scenario.
You can have some real fun with it as well. I remember we did some suspicious packaging testing at a place I worked at once, and we got this kind of box with some dodgy wires coming out of it, and just practice what we would do if we had a suspicious package in the building. So have some fun with it. You test for things like that. You test for fire alarms. Why not test for a breach incident as well?
Yeah, and I think it's the same for a lot of the things on here, really. You can use social engineering to test so many of the things on here to really prove that your information security posture is as mature as you require it to be. So I think it's great to do that real life testing. It really helps them from a practical perspective. It gets it really embedded in people's brains if they're having to work through the process. There's no substitute for learning by doing in reality, is there? And then also you have then the opportunity to learn from these things, which is absolutely key, isn't it? And this comes back, you could do this for your subject access request process as well, and for all those other things, so that you can then say, okay, well, did it work? Did it do what we needed it to do? If not, what do we need to do to change it? What could be better than that?
Absolutely. So I think, in summary, Tanya, if we were to think about the original question that we posed today, which was around how secure is your information, is your institute's information? Does this happen to everybody else? How secure are you? With over half of British universities suffering a data breach in 2020, there's no better time than to get this on the radar now.
No, absolutely. And I would bet that probably half of those were caused by people as well, employees, which goes back to my favourite point on culture and awareness. But yeah, I would say universities have had a bit of a head start on this in some respects, but I think it's really important. I think they've evolved so much over the last couple of years and the last few decades as well. It's a really changed sector. So I think it's really important to go back and look at these things and test them. Are they working? Are they set up as appropriate?
Absolutely. Well, I think really we just want to say thank you for listening to our session today. Don't forget to be information and data privacy aware.